Okay, hold on, don't click away. Bear with me for a second. I want you, yes, you watching this on your phone right now, to take a good long look at your commander decks, if you can. How many decks do you have? How many do you play? When's the last time each of your decks got played? How about you pick up that one that you haven't played in a long time? How bored does it make you feel just looking at it? I mentioned in my first video that I went through a bit of a deck culling recently, where I took apart 6 decks that just weren't gelling with me. It was because of feelings like that, but why did that happen to me? Why do we fall out of love with our commander decks? I think there are a couple different answers, and I want to explore those, so later in this video, I can show you my favorite way to cut down on your number of decks while keeping all of the fun parts of playing them. If you do stay until the end of the video, I'm going to show you my best deck that's come out of the techniques I used, and I'm going to show you how you can do it for yourself. Okay, first I want to talk about why we retire our deck lists, and I want to preface this section of the video that most of these reasons are things that can be solved by retuning a deck, and that is something that I'm personally no stranger to. I would describe myself as a chronic upgrader of my decks. The degree of retuning needed, however, depends on the scale of your problem. Sometimes the energy required to make a particular deck work just doesn't feel worth it, but that certainly is not the case for everyone. If you're the type to never give up on a deck, I wish I had your spirit for all of my decks, but that's just not the case, at least not for me. If I've been trying to adjust a deck slowly for literal years, and it's still not really feeling where I want it to be in my games, it's probably time for me to phase that deck out. That's if I even still reach for it at Commander Night. I'll get to how you can put your old decks back together in a bit, but for now, I've discovered roughly 4 reasons why I can get bored of my decks, and I want to go through each of them and talk about why they are relevant for my modern commander sensibilities. The first reason is that a deck might feel outdated. That's probably the best way for me to describe it. Magic the Gathering is just a very different beast than it was 10 or even 5 years ago, and the more cards available to play in a format, the more apparent this shift becomes. Sometimes you build a commander in a niche space when it comes out, but you wait a couple years and there's no new support, so the play patterns can get a little old. This was part of the problem with my Merkle Lord of Bones deck, which is a weird merging of Enchantress and Aristocrats that mainly just kind of wants creatures with good text boxes. There are a lot of cards that can do cool things with Merkle, but we don't really get them as often as cards for other more supported archetypes, and many of them just aren't good enough in the deck on their own when you don't have your 7-mana commander on the battlefield. Since he's been printed, he's been steadily outpaced by decks that are more common and more flexible, often getting more support as time goes on. A deck can be outdated not in just its support and card choices, but also in its philosophy. For the longest time, I had an upgraded Marju Humans Precon from Commander 2020, which is helmed by Jarina Kudrow. It's pretty much an aggro deck that wants to hit the table quickly, and it has a bit of an Aristocrat's top end where I'm sacrificing my humans to deal the last couple points of damage to my opponents and close out games. The deck was operating under older Commander sentiments, where people played mana rocks in their aggro decks and felt comfortable to include something like a Sun Forger package, which is a really cool toolbox, but it's a bit slower and more controlling than you need for your aggro deck to do well. This made the deck inconsistent in its impact on the game's dynamics. Your aggro decks are more likely to be consistently successful if you can just curve out. It's the same deal as any limited aggro deck. I tried fixing it for a while, but ultimately when I decided I would cut down my number of decks, the damage had just already been done. I'd had too many bad, inconsistent games with it, so I took it apart. This type of experience is related to my second reason. The deck never worked how you wanted. I already mentioned my former Merkle deck, and the 2 most common play patterns for that deck were I would play my 7-mana commander into removal, or my ramp would just work very slowly, and Merkle would start doing the thing he's supposed to do way too late. His built-in protection does fluctuate in its usefulness, but most of the time, Indestructible is not that good, especially when you need to have less than half your life total for it to be online. That's looking at the floor of this deck, but the real disappointment for me was the ceiling just not being as high as I first thought. Getting an enchantment version of Elesh Norn is not as fun when you want your creatures to die and become enchantments. And turning something like a Cinderhaze Wretch into an enchantment is only going to make your opponents not want to play with you anymore. There's a general card quality and cohesion issue, much like my Narrative deck, which I talked about in my first video. Reason number 3 is if a deck feels too generic or redundant. This applies to most of the decks that I scrap, but Jetmir Nexus of Revels leans the most into this reason out of all of them. One thing you may or may not have gathered if you look at my deck list is that I love making tokens. I think of them as a way of cramming a bunch of little cards into one card, and perhaps the biggest lesson you can learn from playing limited formats like Draft or Sealed is that cards that make tokens are, on average, much better than a lot of other cards you could be drafting. Jetmir is a go-to commander for any sort of token strategy and can be very powerful, but that's kind of my problem. A lot of my decks reach the same endpoint, but in ways that to me are more interesting. My Genku Future Shaper deck, for example, is built around all manner of things leaving the battlefield, from baubles to fetch lands to a Salt Skidder. It plays much more in the margins of a game and is about incrementally building up an engine. A token here, a card there, until everything gets mirror formed into an Angel of Indemnity and you swing out for the win. Imhotep the Stormlord, on the other hand, wants to get artifacts in and out of my graveyard, and is again that grindier value deck I tend to enjoy. Wilhelt has more of a typal bend and has a couple more creative, out-of-the-box play patterns. Compared to those, Jetmir is more aggressive, sure, but I don't know. He's just a little bland. I think bland is the word for it. You're basically just trying to count to 9 creatures, and then if you play out Jetmir safely, you just kind of swing out for the win. I don't know. It got old to me after a while. The final reason is if your deck is a bit of a novelty. Sometimes these decks are more gimmicky, where they have one thing that they're built to do, like an extensive combo, and you maybe do it a couple times, but just find the replayability isn't there, or maybe it's a list that has more avenues of play than just a central gimmick, but you built it for some reason other than being drawn to those play patterns. I built my Tiny Bones the Pickpocket deck because my lovely partner, who was very new to Magic the Gathering at the time, saw him in the case at a local game store and just thought he was an adorable character. The plan for that deck was to mill my opponents, equip Tiny Bones with something that can help him get through for combat damage, and then cast the best non-land permanent from their graveyard. It's a play pattern I enjoyed enough to build so we could both play a deck with Tiny Bones at the helm. After a while, however, my partner started to really bounce off of how the deck played, and I just didn't find enough enjoyment out of it either to keep the deck together, so I took it apart. With my partner's blessing, of course. Sometimes a deck just doesn't stick the way you think it might. So those are at least some of the main reasons that we take apart our commander decks. But the best way that I've found to keep the spirit of them around is deceptively simple. In fact, a lot of EDH players do it without realizing that they've done it. And I think if you kind of turn this into more of a conscious activity, you can reignite a spark for a deck that you once had. You just take 2 or 3 or any number of the decks that you were going to scrap, really, and you make them kiss. You combine the decks together, is what I mean. And this is something that can be a bit more difficult than it seems. The most common way this happens is a player stripping a deck for parts. You find the cards, packages, and sub-themes that you can take out and fit into your other decks, and you just port them over. That's only part of the equation, however. In that scenario where you're stripping for parts, you aren't thinking about what is fun about the deck that you're taking apart. You're thinking about what works for your other decks. Sometimes the thing you liked or enjoyed most about a deck is actually different from what would function well in your other decks. For a lot of people, functionality can be really fun, but that's not always the case. There are times, however, where this does work. I most like the feeling of playing aggressive with my Jarina Kudro deck, and the feeling of putting swords on my creatures with my Tiny Bones deck. So I took the best equipment from Tiny Bones and the best humans from Jarina, and I put them in a new deck helmed by Sephiroth the Fallen. But swords and humans does not an effective deck make. I could take these fun cards from these decks, but I would need to bring them in tune with each other by refocusing the overall strategy of the deck. Sephiroth is a 5-mana finisher that requires me to get other creatures on the battlefield and then modify them, meaning they have an equipment or aura attached to them or just some sort of counter on them, like Sephiroth's cell counters. This aggressive strategy that requires a little setup for its commander needs to slow down our opponents so we can delay their deployment of game-ending value engines that go over the top of our vanilla or mostly evasive 7/5s. So instead of human tribal payoffs, I play a suite of hate bears to slap my equipment onto. The resulting puzzle this deck introduces and then solves by itself felt orders of magnitude more compelling to me than playing the two decks that these cards came from. That stripping for parts method does work for most decks you're taking apart, but the list that I'm most proud of building this way comes less from pillaging individual cards and more from combining the two core philosophies behind decks. Out of the 6 decks I took apart in my culling, there are 2 that I haven't mentioned up to this point, because I wanted to give this process its own section. Those decks are Teysa Karlov and Joda the Unifier. Teysa is one of the most ubiquitous Aristocrats commanders. A lot of cards interact with her in very fun and very powerful ways. I wanted this deck to be a flexible and explosive Aristocrats deck, but the results were inconsistent to say the least in the 4 years or so that I've owned it. Sometimes she was just too good for my table, and other times she was way too slow going, most often struggling to get sacrifice fodder on my own board. It's one of the older deck lists that I still had together, which did make it a bit of a victim of my past self, who didn't really have as much purpose in card selection. There were cards in it that I'd grown to like, but just had no business being in the deck. They were too expensive or too slow. Joda, on the other hand, is a much more recent deck of mine. I hadn't been planning on building him, but at my local pre-release for Dominaria United, I had pulled both Joda and a copy of Timeless Lotus in my pre-release kit. Legendary creatures are, on average, given more powerful effects and stat lines. Just looking at Joda's text box, you can tell any deck built around him is going to be good. So, in order to make him less grown-worthy than he usually is, I wanted to try building him as a bit more of a novelty deck. I put together a base deck of 70 or so cards alongside a 230 card pile of legendary permanents, a random 30 of which would be shuffled into the deck each game. These permanents varied highly in power level, uniqueness, and monetary value, so everything from Stang to Emrakul to Cassetto. Here's a selection of some of my favorites, but there's a link to the deck list in the description. The problem with this deck was twofold. The first part isn't huge, but the setup can be a little cumbersome, and I don't mean a beginning of the game setup like your first couple turns, I mean beginning of the game setup. I'm already a guy who can find himself shuffling for a long time at the beginning of a game and grabbing 30 random creatures out of this huge pile and getting them thoroughly shuffled into the deck added unnecessary time onto the games I played with it. The legend pile element also didn't do enough to compromise Joda's broken nature. I ran enough card draw and protection to blank removal and board wipes so the deck would still steamroll people because it doesn't really matter how bad a legendary creature is if Joda is turning it into a stat monster. Even if a board wipe did go through, Joda turning every legend into a 2-for-1 gives the deck an incredible amount of resilience. So I knew I wanted to consolidate some of these decks I was taking apart, and the main reason these two ended up merged together is because in that 230 card legend pile I mentioned was the key I needed, and I'd even bought a fancy version of that card. Radadrobic of Urborg is a 4-mana Orzhov legend with Vigilance, Ward 2, and the text, "Other zombies you control have Vigilance. Whenever another legendary creature you control dies, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's not legendary, and is a 2/2 black zombie, in addition to its other colors and types." Radadrobic was able to fuse my goals when building these decks almost too well. As I pointed out, legendary creatures are powerful, and Rotodropic gives them extra resilience on top of the opportunity to double, triple, or even quadruple their output if I can get multiple token copies of a creature. It allows you to squeeze all of the juice out of each creature that you pick. Now, a single draw of something like Sephiroth or Elasil Core can dovetail into an Aristocrat's win. Elish Norn or Commissar Severino Ravane can similarly push a Joda-esque aggro finish. Every legend has the potential to turn itself or something else into a full engine. Some other benefits of choosing a commander like Rada aren't immediately obvious. If you compare him to the two commanders I was running previously, specifically when I wanted to play them in a game, Rotodropic is much closer to Joda. Ideally, you want to run them out as soon as possible so you can start accruing value with their abilities. The most obvious improvements are in his built-in protection and simpler mana cost. Teysa has the same mana cost, and is a commander you could easily ram into play with a turn 2 mana rock, but Teysa players, you should not do this. Take it as a given, your opponents will remove her before your next turn. Rotodropic's Ward 2 protects him from any targeted removal in the early game, but an even more important form of protection is something you won't even find on the card. Teysa and Joda are both in the EDH Rec Top 100. They have reputations for being powerful, consistent, and widely played. People know what these decks do, and how well they do it. Rada is still in the top 500, but just barely. People just don't see him as often at their table, so there isn't that automatic target on his back, and you are much more likely to get a foothold in any given commander game. To most players, this deck having to prioritize legendary creatures might seem like a harsh deck building restriction. Most of the non-legendary creatures in the Aristocrats canon are better on rate than their legendary equivalents. At their core, Aristocrats decks like Teysa are closer to being combo decks than mid-range or aggro, so they value cheapness and efficiency because there are multiple pieces that they need to assemble quickly. What happens with legendary creatures is they're often given a wider range of flexibility within their effects, which enables significant overlap among your pieces. Tataru is card draw and ramp. Shieldred is interaction and reanimation. Sephiroth is a sack outlet and a blood artist. The deck runs 40 legendary creatures, and all of them are one or more of your core categories: card draw, ramp, removal, or your aristocrats categories, which are sack outlets, reanimation, finishers, and cloning effects for the sake of this deck. All of these creatures can be individually threatening with Rotodropic, but when you get multiple on board, working in tandem with each other, the game can spiral out of control very quickly. My favorite cards in the deck are the ones that really enable that spiral, like Heartless Summoning or We Ride at Dawn. But I wouldn't keep coming back to this deck if it weren't for the variety in the legendary creatures. That is the secret sauce here, and there are always going to be new legendary creatures printed that automatically get considered for this deck. So I've already had this Rotodropic deck together for a little bit, but I wanted to quickly show you a bit of the process. Let's say I became unhappy with more of my current deck lists. Which of these could I combine into one deck? My mind immediately goes to Genku and Imatech, two decks I mentioned earlier in the video to cleverly incept them into your mind. These are both grindy token decks, one caring about non-token permanents leaving the battlefield, and the other about artifacts leaving the graveyard. My Genku deck plays a lot of baubles and other eggs as cheap, card-neutral ways of creating tokens off Genku whenever I might need them, and most of my ramp and interaction also triggers Genku in some form or fashion. This makes Sun Titan effects very valuable, as they are flexible engines that can make us go card positive on our nickel and dime approach. Salvaging Station is much more narrow than the other cards I sort into that Sun Titan category, but when paired with the right bauble and board state, it can easily be the most powerful of the bunch, creating a house of tokens while drawing multiple handfuls of cards. Imatech can be similarly explosive, if not more at times. It leans into the graveyard as a second hand of cards that can spit out 2/2s if your opponents aren't careful. Its nature as an artifact deck in a color not known for potent artifact synergies turn it into much more of a synergy puzzle where all the text on a card matters. Is this card an artifact or not? Can it make something leave my graveyard? If a card is flexible, how worth it is that flexibility compared to other options? It's the type of deck where you have to use the whole buffalo, so to speak, when including a card. Something like Egon, God of Death, who can also be played as Throne of Death, is a card that I used to see as a very good inclusion because it can do everything you want for very cheap. The Command Zone podcast even included it in their upgrade guide for the Necron Precon, for the same reasons that I've been running it all these years. It fills your graveyard, it triggers Imatech, and it draws you cards, but it isn't an artifact on its front half, so I can't trigger Imatech if it moves out of the graveyard. And it's not particularly good or efficient at the roles it tries to fill in the deck, so I cut it for a card better at doing what it does, or one that is roughly similar but helps keep the glue of the wider deck list together. That's how granular the card selection needs to be to make the whole thing work. Tuning it has been rigorous, and the deck still has problems, but it's one of those decks that I don't think I'm ever going to give up on. To combine two decks in a satisfying way, you need to think hard about what you like most about them. What cards and synergies brought you the most joy in past games? Once you've isolated those key parts of the deck, you can look for a commander that can bridge together these disparate elements. There are a lot of ways to search for a commander this way, but my preferred methods have to be searching O-tags on Scryfall and looking at what other commanders often include the commanders you're disassembling in the 99. For an example of what I'm talking about, Golbez Crystal Collector has the most decks running Imatech in the 99, justifiably so. Golbez triggers Imatech at the end of your turn by returning an artifact to your hand, and then the two tokens created by Imatech are artifacts, which trigger Golbez's first Surveil ability. They both fuel each other without needing much else going on. That first ability also plays super well with Salvaging Station and the baubles that I like playing in Genku, so if I liked the graveyard and artifact elements and wanted to ditch the tokens angle, Golbez is a super solid control option. However, you don't have to stick to the same colors as your original decks. What I really love about Genku and Imatech, in addition to the Salvaging Station stuff, is the ability to create a token engine that works at instant speed. If I actually wanted to combine a grindy graveyard deck with a token engine, the recent Quintorius History Chaser is the commander I'd actually play with. His static ability triggers in the same conditions as Imatech. He also has a bit of the same synergy puzzle with a little extra kick from the Planeswalker abilities. The biggest problems I have with my Genku and Imatech decks are that they can sometimes run out of things to do, a problem that Quints +1 helps with smoothing out your draws and seeing more of the deck on average. Red's high volume of discard on efficient creatures and spells really help make a deck like this feel better on average, and the inherent access to discard on the commander makes Currency Converter and other exile off discard effects much more reasonable than they would feel in something like Imatech. Overall, I think this list would salvage a lot of what I love about Genku and Imatech should I ever take them apart. Lastly, real quick, I wanted to talk about what to do if you're at a breaking point with the deck, but you don't want to let go of the idea or the commander. If I felt that Merkle and Teysa weren't working, but I wanted to keep them, my best recommendation for new and old players alike is to take the deck apart, like physically, and look at it. Unsleeve and unsort everything. Don't just open like a deck building website. Once you've done that, look at your commander, think about what you wanted this deck to be, and go one card at a time. Read and reread them, scrutinize every detail to see if that card really makes sense in this deck. You can even do this with a friend. Invite them out for coffee and go over all of the cards to get a fresh set of eyes on your process. They might have ideas that you hadn't thought of, or see through lines that you couldn't. I came up with this concept of synergy slop in my previous video, where you get pulled into so many different lanes and sub-themes you think you can fit in your deck that you begin playtesting and everything just falls apart. This card-by-card reevaluation is a good way of inching back from that style of deck building and building more from the floor. With my Jarina deck, I tried doing something very similar, except I switched out the commander for Trin and Sylvar, which are different, but in the same theme and color combination. It can help you get your bearings if you're planning a big shift in how you're constructing a deck. So, what are some decks of yours that you could see yourself combining? I want to hear about them. Thank you so much for watching. If you made it here, I'd appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed to my channel. I did not expect my first video to do as well as it ended up doing, but thank you to everyone that left me feedback in the comments. It was very heartening. Previews for The Hobbits have me thinking a lot about Universes Beyond, particularly from a standpoint of card art and why we care about it. So that'll probably be what my next video is about, but no promises. It might switch up in the process. All right. Thanks for watching. See ya.